Good evening, everyone, as we populate the room to our first, I believe, conversation for 2024 with our scholar in residence, Dr. Camesha Scruggs. We're letting people just get in the room and get situated first. So we'll start our conversation probably around 6:08. Why not 08? We'll take off at 6:08. Your microphones have been muted. If you'd like to converse with our speaker or any of us, you can use the chat function. And we'd love to know what range of people from the country, what parts of the country people are from. We might do that as well. Even we have most coasts and corners represented. Anyone from the central, Wisconsin, Ohio, New England, Niagara Falls, yes, Texas, yeah, excellent. And it's interesting because Dr. Scruggs, her radius is the span of the country as well. So it's good to see her people, fans and friends, colleagues in the room. All right. So we will be recording this on this evening, and we will be posting this on our YouTube station, our channel. So please be mindful of that. If you choose not to want your camera on, you can feel free to mute your camera or turn your camera off if you don't want to be on our YouTube channel, but the conversation will be on our YouTube channel. Okay, I have 6:08 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Good evening, everyone. Once again, my name is Ida Jones, and I'm the co-president for the National Collaborative for Women's History Sites. And I want to welcome you all to our conversation on this evening with our former board member, Dr. Camesha Scruggs. So we're having our virtual event, and we are going to be talking with Women's History Month about women. I want to just also lift up the work of the collaborative. We have a podcast that has been released thus far, and we're looking at the National Votes for Women's Trail. There are about 10 installations or 10 episodes thus far available. You can check our website for more information on that, and I'll also try to find the link and drop it in the chat for you as well. So welcome from across America, from the Mid-Atlantic to the far west, to the central, to the south, and the northeast. I'm going to turn it over to another board member, Joni DiMartino. Joni.
Thank you so much, Ida. Welcome everyone this evening. My name is Joni DiMartino. As Ida mentioned, I am a board member for the National Collaborative for Women's History Sites, and I am also on the program committee, so I have the honor today of introducing Dr. Scruggs. I am the museum director and site superintendent of the Prudence Crandall Museum in Connecticut as well. Dr. Camesha Scruggs is an assistant professor of history at Central Connecticut State University in New Britain, Connecticut. Camesha received a doctorate in history at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and her BA and MA in history from Texas Southern University. Her research fields and teaching interests are 20th century United States, African American, and public history. Her dissertation project, quote, "We Poor Negro Women Have to Work, Black Women Domestic Workers in Texas, 1900 to 1940, unquote, examines the lived experiences of Texas African-American women domestic servants in the early 20th century and how interventions from social, civic, government, secondary, and higher education institutions impacted their occupation." She served on the executive boards of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History and the National Collaboration of Women's History Sites. She is a project stakeholder for the Du Bois Freedom Center in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. She performs volunteer work for various community preservation initiatives, bringing stories to broader audiences. She continues to connect with local historical societies, sites, and organizations, ensuring diverse narratives are preserved and presented. She is a recent contributor to, quote, It's Our Movement Now, Black Women's Politics and the 1977 National Women's Conference, unquote, and, quote, Forging Freedom in W.E.B. Du Bois' Twilight Years, unquote. Her current manuscript project is a further examination of historically Black colleges and universities, Young Women's Christian Association, and the Works Progress Administration's role in domestic service training during the New Deal era. We'd like to welcome Dr. Camesha Scruggs. Thank you.
Oh my goodness. Thank you, Joni. Who is this person that you're talking about is the question. But thank you. Thank you, NCWHS, who really fostered my work, was able to support me during my dissertation writing process, and even now, as a junior faculty member, as a new faculty member. So thank you all for the support, and definitely for this opportunity. So tonight is really just going to be a brief discussion of some of the work that I've done, and some of the work that I'm continuing to do. When I think about my work, I have told people that it is an academic love letter to my grandmother, to community elder women who performed wage earning domestic work. Now, of course, they were not formally trained in it, but nevertheless, their work was still valuable. Their work was still important. My work, of course, examines the formal, the educational side of domestic service education, particularly in the early 20th century. Let me share my screen and make sure I have all of the things. All right. So like I said, the topic of my talk tonight is ladies learning labor. I tend to use alliterations a lot, but it's really going to be domestic service education in the early 20th century. Really, the two kind of simple, I guess, kind of the main points I'm going to talk about are I'm going to focus on what are the questions and what are the goals. The questions that I examine in my particular work are, does housework require training? And is housework an occupation that deserves pay? And my answer to both of those questions, based on research, is yes, housework requires training. If that were not so, then why would we have investments? Why would we have federal interventions during the New Deal era? Why would historically Black colleges and universities, for example, why would some of their training in their home economics programs, right? Why would they include things that you would use in the occupation of domestic service, even just going by domestic labor descriptions from the 1930s of what is a maid, what is a housemaid? Some of those include being able to take care of children, to be able to prepare meals, to be able to clean homes, right? So indeed, it does require training. And to my second question, is housework an occupation that deserves pay? I would obviously say yes, right? If once again, if that were not the case, then why are we still having advocacy efforts even now in 2024? Why was pay an option, or why was it an issue even in the New Deal era when we're having initiatives such as Social Security, when African American, or particularly individuals who were in the occupation of domestic work, were not receiving credit, right? We're not able to receive some of those benefits. So to answer these two questions, overwhelmingly yes. So, which brings me to kind of what I observed in my research in looking at some of these domestic service education initiatives. These are just some of the quotes that are coming from sources including federal reports for the National Youth Administration in the 1930s, even mission statements from college programs for their domestic science programs. And even with some of these social and civic initiatives that are happening in the local level, whether it's through a group of club women or the YWCA, right? So some of these things include not only will housemaids be trained in neatness and dependability, that was evident in the training, but it was also in my examination of some of these advertisements for employment. Examining newspaper ads, they would say looking for a neat maid, looking for a dependable maid. So of course, these programs are catering to the market, right? Or the need or desire for trained domestic workers. And even, like I said, this is happening in educational spaces as well. This is a particular mission statement from a historically Black college that said training in home economics and related branches of learning was basically brought about to bring students training into closer relationships with life's occupations. They were aware that they are training their students for a job market, right? Which is a question that parents often ask when they send their students off to college. For example, what skills are you going to get by sitting in this classroom, right? So that is still apparent today. And the last one, marked progress demonstrates the fact that if they are to hold their jobs, colored domestics must keep informed. This is coming from social and civic organizations that are creating these domestic training institutes, these worker institutes in which they are training women in the art of domestic science in the hopes that they will obtain employment. Civic and social organizations, for example, like the YWCA, also manage to have these kind of employment agencies in which individuals would inquire of the YWCA, do you have any trained domestics that you would recommend, right? So they kind of serve as training, but also as an employment agency as well. So these are just some of the things that I was seeing in these various instances of domestic service training. So what I'm going to talk about first is we'll start with the social and civic organization. I use a few acronyms. The first one is the YWCA, the Young Women Christian Association. So after looking through their organizational records at the Sophia Smith collection, I noticed that there was literally initiatives that were happening and how can we train young women in domestic work. But the particular instance that I found interesting in some of my work was the Young Women Christian Association branches in Texas, particularly the Maria Morgan branch in Dallas, Texas, which is a African-American branch of the YWCA. So the documents that are on this particular slide is the acquisition of what was called the Homemaker Industrial and Trade School. Now, the Homemaker Industrial Trade School was started by a group of African-American club women in 1920. The Young Women Christian Association of Dallas eventually acquired it and turned it into the Homemakers Industrial School, and also serving as the genesis of the Maria Morgan branch, the Black branch of, or in Dallas, of the YWCA, right? And so this, of course, is deed of sale to me that lets me know that indeed this work has value. And the fact that a larger organization, a larger women's organization, is willing to take on the initiative of training these young women. We see evidence in newspaper ads that say, for example, there was one in 1929 that said, the Homemakers Industrial School is hosting an open house in which they were demonstrating their service skills, in which they made out a well-planned meal and service was great. So we're seeing the fruits, per se, of this domestic service training and how it's being used in the community. I also saw instances of this in Houston as well with the Blue Triangle branch, in which a similar initiative, they are creating an African-American branch. The African-American branch serves as a training institute for domestic workers in the Houston, Black domestic workers in Houston. There is a YWCA house for YWCA African-American women, and they're also having a employee referral service. So once again, we're seeing the large social civic organization taking on this work of training women to give them employment. And so the second one is on a federal level. So of course, the Great Depression happens. FDR creates the New Deal. Part of his initiatives, of course, is to give individuals training, to give them skills. Under the larger WPA, the Works Progress Administration, there is a group called the National Youth Administration. Now, what I found interesting from the National Youth Administration is that there were these domestic training programs, particularly the one in Texas. Young girls from 15 to about 19 were selected from all over the state, and they would come to the National Youth Administration Institute of sorts, and it was housed on the campus of a historically Black college, Prairie View A&M. This is in the 1930s. This image that I have on the right is from one of their graduating classes. In this, we talk about the history of the project, what is the purpose of the project, and on the right, we talk about how trainees are getting jobs. So they're saying that once you come through this National Youth Administration Domestic Service Program, you can be placed in a job. And they proudly say that, you know, for example, a young lady who took our course, got a certificate, and is now going to work in the home of someone, or they received a job in domestic service. So we're seeing the effectiveness of this program, which happened to be housed on the college of a historically Black college, which will probably be a part of my later work, probably part of my book project in how I'm looking at this particular institution. Prairie View A&M is kind of the center of domestic service education, because not only are they housing the National Youth Administration program, their home economics department trains teachers that go to predominantly Black high schools throughout Texas and are creating these home economic with the domestic service component in their courses. So, of course, established after the Great Depression, the National Youth Administration, the Negro Division, of course, was directed by Mary McLeod Bethune, which is another interesting concept because she is aware of domestic service training through the Nanny Helen Burroughs domestic training that's happening in DC. So I can only imagine what the conversation that is happening between those two, which is something I want to explore further. The domestic service training, of course, is held at Prairie View in 1938. The image on the right is the actual report that was submitted. And what's interesting about this as well is that First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, she makes a visit in 1939. She says in her My Day diary, I'm stopping at Prairie View to check out the National Youth Administration program to see how it's running, right? So once again, we kind of think about what are the federal interventions. I've not seen anything in the YWCA records as far as Eleanor having any commentary, but maybe down the line, perhaps. But Eleanor Roosevelt is aware of domestic workers. There in the Department of Labor, there is correspondence between Eleanor Roosevelt and domestics, which was the reason or the impetus for my title for my dissertation, We Poor Negro Women Have to Work. That came from a Black woman domestic in Fort Worth, Texas, writing to Eleanor Roosevelt, talking about the experiences of what is the work conditions and advocating for themselves, right? So Eleanor is everywhere in the work. So once again, we see the federal intervention of domestic worker training. And the last thing I'll just kind of briefly touch on, or that I've talked about already, is historically Black colleges and universities. Like I said, historically Black colleges and universities in Texas talk about training individuals for service. We see that come somewhat, particularly when we think about like vocational training. When we think about that, that comes kind of out of the Tuskegee model of Booker T. Washington, in which we're training individuals for service. And Prairie View definitely is aware of that. Prairie View is for the state of Texas, when we think about land grant institutions, Prairie View is that land grant institution specifically for African Americans in Texas. So we see almost from its outset in the 1870s, training individuals, domestic service is a part of the institution, as far as training and paying domestic workers to work on campus, to having practice cottages that their students from the home economics department are participating in. Now, the image on the left, of course, is a standard course catalog, things that students and parents see when students are registering for classes. And what I noticed in the home economics department was that mission statement of their training individuals for this service. They are taking courses in things such as setting up service, taking care of homes, and also, like I said, they're training teachers. They're training teachers in domestic arts, and they're going into these school districts and training young women, young men, right, in their home economics with a domestic science, with a domestic service component in that domestic science course. And so we see that there really is an investment in this work, and that this work requires training, despite the idea that domestic work is just women's work and it's unskilled work. If that were the case, then why would we have had these interventions? Some additional evidence that I located were letters to the editors to women's magazines asking for trained domestics and having them be able to work on or be able to operate these newer appliances. We even see it in advertisements. For example, there was one that I located in the 1930s for General Electric. There's a domestic, and there's this idea that, yes, she has the appliance, but there's still a training that's required with that. I can only imagine, right, that there was an instruction need. So once again, there's this idea that training is required for work that's considered to be gender-based and non-skilled. So for me, it's been a great exploration into what does it look like? Examining course guides, examining what are some of the texts that are being used, everything from cookbooks to looking even at other programs, home economics at Cornell, looking at the Chicago School of Cooking. How are they taking all of these skills and the sciences that are required in that? Because in some of these courses that are taught on college campuses, they're also taught about the chemistry of it. They're taught about how to, what is the appropriate temperature for maintaining food, and how do you take care of children. So for me, that also goes back to the idea that yes, this work is skilled. This work does require training, and yes, this work deserves pay. And we see that as we move through the 20th century, as they're advocating for themselves. And we also see how some of those same advocacy education moments lead into other moments throughout the African-American history. So that's really just a brief discussion of some of the things that I found, or as I call them, adventures and antics in the archives, and learning about a work that has benefited me through my ancestors and through my community elder them. So thank you. Any questions? Any thoughts?
I think Joni's going to moderate the conversation. There's one question in the chat already.
Mhm.
I have my own, but I will hold off.
Okay.
So Dr. Scruggs, we have a question. Was the U.S. Labor Department's Women's Bureau involved in any of this?
Yes. So to answer that question, part of my research, of course, required me going into National Archives, Record Group 86, and looking at the sources, right? Some of the reports that are written about domestic work, some of the reports of domestic work. And of course, one of the things that were coming up were, what is the treatment? What is the examples? How is the employer-employer relationship? So yes, and even in some of these YWCA events, or there was a particular instance in Houston through the Negro Men's Labor Association that they brought down the director of the Women's Labor Bureau to come and give a talk on domestic workers. So yes, they were definitely involved in these initiatives. They're pretty much, I would say, their reports are what's fueling some of these education initiatives.
Thank you. If anyone else has any questions, they can put it in the comments or just, I guess, raise your hand to ask.
Ida has raised her hand here, and I will take, I guess, a privilege here. Congratulations on your work. It's very insightful. I love the fact that you call it a love letter, an academic love letter to your ancestors. That's a very beautiful statement, because I'm not sure if more than 70, if not 95% of African-American women had ancestors who did this kind of work for employment. And the FDR did not cover it in Social Security either, but that's neither here nor there. So my question is comment and question together. So comment, Fleming Kittrell, who was at Howard University, who was the architect for the home economics program there at Howard, went to Cornell and got her PhD in chemistry. She might be a very good person to kind of look at this kind of modernization as an early technologist, because that's really why they wanted these women to be a certain way. I'd love to get your opinion on that. I'm also diving into Nannie Helen Burroughs, which I will hold privately to myself, but will equally share with you. Because she was looking at the idea of microeconomics, because having seen her mother as a single parent, having to provide for her children, what could women do? What could colored women do who didn't have pedigree or husbands to do certain things? So I think Burroughs has a different kind of aggressive way of engaging this work, not to be limiting, but also to be a springboard, because it has. So I'd like your opinions on that. So I guess in brief, your opinions on Kittrell, and then Burroughs and her model, and then ultimately, how does this kind of provide this microeconomics for working class and poor women?
Okay. So with Fleming Kittrell, indeed, right, we look at Cornell, right? We look at the Cornell home economics program as kind of the standard bearer, right? But for me, I wondered, yes, Cornell home economics, but how is that applicable to Black women or, African Americans that are attending HBCUs? Are they getting, are there similarities? Are there going to be modifications to home economics training? Because yes, home economics as a science is great, but how is it going to be applicable? How is it going to be a wage earning thing, right? So I've started looking at Kittrell. I definitely need to expand on that more. That will definitely be something that I look at. I've already made a request to go and have an archives adventure at Cornell at some point and see what happens with that. With Nannie Helen Burroughs, of course, there was, her domestic, her whole domestic training institute, right? Even in some of her archives, I saw the request from women from Texas that are requesting information, whether it's for admission or whether they are just trying to find out more about the program. And one of the interesting things I found is there was a particular correspondent between a Black woman domestic in Galveston, Texas. She forms a domestic workers union in Galveston. So she has corresponded with Helen Burroughs. And I want to explore that a little further and see, did Helen Burroughs give her some of the information from like her national, Association of Wage Earners, right? How is she influencing these advocacy efforts for domestic workers in Texas? Because this particular young woman out of Galveston is showing up at like union conferences, union conventions as early as like the 19 teens, So definitely something I want to expand on. As far as microeconomics, I mean, we see these women as sometimes sometimes the head of household as far as wage earning, right? Because sometimes there were no opportunities for their husbands. So the work that they're doing is literally maintaining their household. So we have to think about, like, what does that mean to do the work, but also carry kind of that burden as well? And does that differ from domestics that simply are going through an employment agency and doing the work and going home? Or are some of these same women that are going through these domestic training initiatives, are they doing work in, right? Which brings me back to like Elizabeth Clark Lewis, living in, living out, right? How does that factor in? So these are things that I kind of want to explore further in my book project. So we'll see. And I will definitely, of course, come to DC and we will have to chat and have a good discussion, a good archival discussion about, what are some of these gems that I'm going to find for this project.
So we have a lot of questions now in the chat.
Okay.
The next one is, was there any connection or comment on rural electrification in Texas in the 1930s? So maybe women who did not have electricity at home, yet might work for families in towns that did.
That's a good question. I'll have to think about, did that have an impact? Because I know that there have been images, of course, of African-American women that are working in homes with electrification. Like I know, I want to say some of like maybe the Farm Services Administration, like there was a series of photos. I think it may have been like Walcott was the photographer, in which we see these Black women domestics are working in homes or homes of white women, right, that have electrification. And I wonder, how did that impact them, right? Were they thinking, okay, well, I have, I'm working in a home with all this, but then I go back to my own personal home. How does that impact me? For me, I'd have to also think about examining census records. And that's something that I started to do in my dissertation, but we'll definitely explore further, right? Looking at some of the domestic that may have lived like in close proximity to their employers. There was one in particular, San Antonio domestic that worked for a family for 40 years. And looking at the census records, there was proximity. They lived like literally within the same block. Make me think about that. And also, are those types of things mentioned in employment ads? Because we see in some of these employment ads that, there's room, there's boarding. Are some of those things discussed in employment ads? Would that encourage, domestic to consider a job? Because that may be a challenge if they don't have electrification in their home, but they're going in to work in a home that has one. So definitely something to consider. I saw Dr. Sumler Edmond with her hand up.
Thank you, Dr. Scruggs. I wanted to ask you, you were talking about the NYA. And I was wondering, have you had a chance, or I'm hoping these are available, the curriculum. I'm wondering if the Prairie View curriculum was similar or standard to others. Because I think that would give us, a good sense of what's going on. Because I know Bethune just had the African-American group under her. Right. And I have one, if you can answer that, and then I have one comment I wanted to make as well.
Okay. In the National Youth Administration report, that image that I showed of the report, right, like they actually show the coursework and all of that. And so honestly, I never thought to like put that alongside like the course guide for Prairie View, because they were operating on the same campus. So I can only imagine that there were some overlap, right, between the home economics program at the college and, the National Youth Administration, the actual program that's happening on campus as well. So I definitely want to look at that. And also, I'm sure because of course, Mary McLeod Bethune is running the Negro division, is this happening at other HBCU campuses across the country, right? And that may be a whole another second book project, just looking at like national youth administrations, and historically Black colleges.
Or did they have any of this at some of the white colleges for white women, or only in the Black?
So the one in Texas was only held at Prairie View, and it was for African American women. And so that's something I would look at. But yet when we look at like some of these posters, right, like the things that are appearing in the Library of Congress, like the posters that are coming out of Illinois, for example, right? I don't know if there were programs, for example, for African Americans in Illinois, because if you look at the image on the posters, it seems to be geared towards white women to take advantage of some of these home, like domestic arts programs. So that's definitely something I want to think about and look into.
Let me just say this one quick thing. This must have happened at least 40, 45 years ago, back in the day. I was visiting my aunt. I had just begun teaching, and I was sharing my slides from West Africa. So the whole community came. But anyway, one elderly woman came. I had known her for some time. And she said that, I don't know how we got on this subject, but she said that when she came, we were in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and this woman had moved from the South to Pittsburgh. And when she came up, she was looking for a job. So I'm sure this was like in the 30s. And the owner, having all white employees, was pretty reluctant to accept her, but she talked with him and she said, I don't know if she had finished, but she had had significant training at Tuskegee, and this was a laundry. And so he said, you're hired. I mean, I don't know if he said it like that, but she did get the job, and she did use Tuskegee to get it. She actually went there.
Right, because of course we think about the Tuskegee model, right, of uplift and training for service. So I can only imagine, of course, if there is evidence, right, or
domestic. No, she took the domestic course, like the home economics course.
Oh, wow,
she took
okay.
that, so she was ready. She had all the training. She was good.
Perhaps maybe that did do. Good to know.
Wonderful talk.
Thank you, Dr. Summerlin. Dr. Williams.
My question is a follow-up. Basically, when you look at the domestic training programs like the National Youth Administration plus those college programs, they were quite similar. My question is, when graduates and or those who organize them, particularly in the historically Black colleges or even in the YWCA, or in the case of Buffalo, the YMCA had 1 day a week when they trained women, and there was a domestic training program. Did they use those programs to advocate moving out of that industry or professionalizing it to the extent that they established businesses? In other words, was it a springboard, and what kind of advocacy might have emerged?
Okay. As far as, I don't know if they would advocate for, springboarding off into that, but I know that in like some of the YWCA archives, there was the advocacy for standardized hours or for certain pay. So we definitely saw that like in the 1940s, we start to see like the YWCA start to advocate and encouraging, their YWCA members to, if you have a domestic, write and advocate for standardized hours. So we can see it in the YWCA at least advocating for like standardized wages and at least standardized work hours. So that's what I've seen thus far.
Thank you.
There was a comment in the chat that says, in case no one has yet mentioned, there are images of NYA youth at Bethune-Cookman in the LOC collection. I recall an image of a young girl holding pickled eggs. She was taught this skill in the Bethune NYA course.
Ooh, okay.
And another question is, are there any historic house museums that are using your work as part of their historical interpretation to the public?
Not yet, but funny thing about this domestic work thing, I tell people that I got into the topic and I got into public history. It's an internship gone awry. I was a cultural resource diversity intern for the National Park Service in undergrad, and my first project was looking at all of the women that worked in the Lincoln home in Springfield, Illinois. So with that, we looked at census records, we looked at individuals that said that they worked for Lincoln. And for me, it made me think, okay, so if we're working for, a person that's thinking about like unpaid labor for a group of people, how is that impacting? And also at the time, I went into a bookstore on a Saturday, and a book that I found of interest and I picked up was Elizabeth Clark Lewis's Living In, Living Out. I was like, okay, that's it, fine. And so from there, that's really how I got into public history and how I got into my dissertation topic. Hopefully, we'll think about domestic work in the early 20th century. I know that there is a project, I believe the Thomas Edison House in New Jersey. I think they currently have a project where they're looking at domestic workers. So hopefully I'll be able to provide additional insight on what does that look like in the early 20th century. So we'll see.
Thank you. The next question is, did you investigate any training films for domestic workers? Some clips of these New Deal films are in the documentary Freedom Bags, and the person asking the question was interested in knowing more information about them.
Thank you, Dr. Jellison, for that question. I have seen the documentary Freedom Bags, but I have not examined as far as domestic training films. I know that there have, of course, during the New Deal era, we have, these films of what's happening as far as the programs overall. I've located a lot of like images of domestic programs that are happening. In Texas, I know that there was one in San Antonio, for example, that featured African-American women. It's a scene of them somewhat cleaning like kind of a living room area. But as far as like films, no, I've seen definitely photographic images, but definitely something I will investigate further.
And there's a question related to suffrage, whether or not you found any connections between suffragists and this training movement, either before or after 1920.
Oh, okay. As far as women advocating to vote, there was a interesting find in the archive when I was working on my dissertation. For me, there was oh my goodness, in the archives in Houston. Actually, it was the personal papers of Miss Adair and her mother. Some of her papers were included in that. And what I found interesting is that she had her mother's poll tax receipt from, I want to say 1925. On it, of course, it says that she paid $1.75, and she specifically put her occupation as housekeeper on that. To me, meant a lot. It lets me know that these women who are doing this work, right, are willing to invest, right, in the opportunity to have their voices heard. We see, I saw a few of those, but as far as on a larger scale, not yet. I'm sure if I delve a little further, I can definitely find more poll tax receipts for household workers, right, and how they would use that to advocate for themselves, to advocate for their work and their value and their voices to be heard.
Thank you. There's a follow-up question that was the training successful in raising wages? Were graduates of these programs able to earn higher wages than workers who are not?
That's something that I really want to investigate. did these young women who are getting training and certificates from Prairie View A&M, right, for example, are they able to advocate for higher wages, right? Are they able to, whether they're being placed in a home or whether they're answering an advertisement in the newspaper, are they able to say, well, I have formal training, so I should be paid more? That I don't know. I may have to look at, or maybe even consider doing oral history interviews, or seeing if I can find any additional evidence on that. I haven't found any yet. But I would think that that would give them an advantage, right? There would be a preference, especially for women employers, right, that are listening to the advice of a women's magazine, like Women's Home Journals, that are, you know, giving them advice on how to pay their workers. We'll see. What I've seen in some of these ladies' home journals ads or advice columns is, you know, they're touting that, oh, well, they were able to get a domestic to work for cheaper than what the domestic is asking for. So hopefully there were some victories in which some of these domestics advocated for themselves and advocated for higher wages individually, collectively. I think that didn't start happening until we started having like domestic workers unions come into prominence, especially like in the 30s and the 40s. When I think about like the domestic workers union in New York, for example, that's when we start to think about like a standardized wage, a decent wage that would be considered sufficient, regardless of training.
Thank you. Are there any further questions? I can't see if anyone has their hand raised. There's just nothing further in the chat at this point.
Let's see, Anne said, thanks. I think you're likely right about the unions. And of course, definitely checking out the project that was done at Smith College with Dr. Guglielmo, her domestic workers, where she's like literally giving a timeline of that. And just for me, looking at like how they are looking at their union advocacy efforts, looking, for example, there was a Houston Black newspaper that mentions like in the 1920s, for example, that a group of domestics organized themselves into a union. So we definitely see that they are willing to think about unionizing, even though they weren't accepted into the larger unions that we often think about like AFL and CIO, but they are definitely advocating for themselves.
Ida, can I turn this back over to you for a wrap up or?
Surely. Thank you so much, Dr. Scruggs and Joni, for the conversation and the exchange. Thank you for attending, all the attendees from all parts of the country. This was a very insightful talk and really kind of granular, looking at Texas and these connections of the women's club movement. That's really very impressive. So we will look forward to seeing you again when we have our next talk. I put in the March for Democracy podcast that the National Collaborative is working on right now. There are 10 available episodes of the podcast that kind of chronicle the effort to document the suffrage movement nationwide, both virtually and physically with markers. So please check out our podcast. Thank you, Dr. Scruggs. We look forward to your book, and happy Good Women's History Month in the next 3 or 4 days before we close out 2024. Thank you so much and have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Camesha. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.